old man starved in a cage by his son. But what happened next changed everything. Before we begin, drop a comment below to tell us where you're watching from. If you believe the truth always comes out, like and subscribe. Now sit back and enjoy the story. Nestled in the heart of rural Ohio, the sleepy town of Maplewood was a place where time seemed to stand still. The air carried the faint scent of pine and freshly cut grass, while rows of white picket fences lined streets that wound lazily through fields of golden corn. It was the kind of town where everyone knew each other's business, or at least thought they did. Gossip flowed as freely as the coffee at Betty's diner, but some secrets remained buried beneath layers of politeness and silence. At the edge of town, down a narrow dirt road shaded by towering oaks, stood an old farmhouse surrounded by overgrown weeds. This was where Frank Reynolds lived, or rather existed, in solitude. At 72 years old, Frank had spent decades building things with his hands: cradles for newborns, tables for wedding feasts, coffins for those who'd reached their final rest. His craftsmanship was renowned throughout Maplewood, and he'd been a fixture in the community until arthritis forced him into retirement 5 years ago. Now his tools gathered dust in the barn, and his once bright eyes dulled with age and loneliness. Frank wasn't entirely alone, though. His son, Ethan Reynolds, had moved back home 6 months earlier after losing his job as a mechanic in Cleveland. Once a bright young man full of promise, Ethan now bore the weight of failure on his shoulders. Alcoholism had taken hold of him, turning him sullen and unpredictable. The father-son relationship had always been strained, marked by years of misunderstandings and unspoken resentment. But Ethan's return only deepened the divide. Neighbors whispered about raised voices coming from the Reynolds property late at night, though no one dared intervene. After all, family matters were private, even in a town like Maplewood. What no one realized, however, was just how bad things had gotten behind the closed doors of the Reynolds household. Rumors hinted at tension, sure, but nothing could have prepared the townsfolk for what would soon come to light. Frank Reynolds, beloved carpenter and pillar of the community, was found locked inside a makeshift iron cage in his own basement. And the person responsible? His own flesh and blood, Ethan. But this wasn't the end of the story. Not even close. What happened next would force the people of Maplewood, and Frank himself, to confront questions they'd long avoided. Can someone truly be redeemed? Is forgiveness possible when trust is shattered beyond repair? And where does the line between right and wrong blur when love and pain become intertwined? As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the Reynolds farm, the stage was set for a tale of mystery, regret, and the fragile bonds that tie families together, even when they threaten to break. It was a crisp autumn morning when the quiet of Maplewood was shattered by the shrill ring of Mrs. Evelyn Harper's voice echoing down the lane. Evelyn, a spry widow in her late 60s who prided herself on baking pies for church fundraisers and keeping an eye on her neighbors, had grown suspicious when she hadn't seen Frank around town all week. It wasn't unusual for him to keep to himself these days. After all, he'd become something of a recluse since Ethan returned, but there was something about the eerie stillness at the Reynolds farm that gnawed at her gut. When she arrived at the property, the front door was slightly ajar, creaking softly in the breeze. "Frank?" she called out, stepping cautiously inside. The house smelled stale, as if it hadn't been aired out in days. Dust motes floated lazily through shafts of sunlight streaming through cracked blinds. Her calls went unanswered. Her unease deepened as she moved toward the kitchen, where unwashed dishes, piled high in the sink, and a half-empty bottle of whiskey sat on the counter. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. She followed the sound of faint scratching coming from below, leading her to the basement door. The wooden stairs groaned under her weight as she descended into the dimly lit space. What she saw next froze her blood. There in the corner of the damp, musty basement stood an iron cage, a relic from Frank's woodworking days, rusted and grimy with age. Inside lay Frank Reynolds, slumped against the bars, his gaunt face pale and lifeless. His eyes were closed, but his expression was one of anguish, as though even in death he couldn't escape the torment of his final days. Evelyn screamed. The cage was locked from the outside, secured with a heavy chain and padlock that looked newer than the rest of the structure. A single overturned water jug lay nearby, its contents long evaporated. There were no signs of food or sustenance anywhere close. It didn't take a detective to piece together what had happened. Frank had starved to death over several days, trapped like an animal in his own home. Word spread quickly through Maplewood. By noon, the small police department had cordoned off the property, and Sheriff Tom Grayson was overseeing the investigation. Neighbors gathered in hushed clusters outside the yellow tape, their faces etched with shock and disbelief. "How could this happen?" someone muttered. "Who would do such a thing?" another whispered. But deep down, everyone already suspected the truth. Sheriff Grayson found Ethan sitting on the porch, nursing a beer despite the early hour. His hands trembled as he brought the bottle to his lips, and his bloodshot eyes avoided meeting the sheriff's gaze. "Where have you been, Ethan?" Grayson asked, his tone measured but firm. I don't know," Ethan stammered, his voice hoarse. "I left for a few days, needed to clear my head." "And you didn't notice your father was missing, or hear anything unusual before you left?" Ethan shook his head, but the guilt written across his face told a different story. Inside the house, investigators uncovered more damning evidence. Empty liquor bottles scattered throughout the living room, a note scrawled in shaky handwriting on the kitchen table. "Dad, I can't keep doing this." And receipts showing recent purchases of chains and locks. As the pieces fell into place, the picture became horrifyingly clear. Ethan Reynolds had locked his own father in that cage and left him there to die. But why? And what had driven a man to commit such an unspeakable act against the person who raised him? The questions lingered in the air, unanswered for now. As the investigation unfolded, it became increasingly difficult for anyone, least of all Sheriff Grayson, to deny the mounting evidence against Ethan Reynolds. The pieces of the puzzle painted a damning portrait of a troubled man pushed to the brink, but they also left gaping holes that begged further exploration. First came the eyewitness account from Betty Monroe, who lived 2 farms down. She recounted how she'd been outside feeding her chickens late one evening when she heard shouting coming from the Reynolds property. "I couldn't make out every word," Betty told the sheriff, wringing her hands nervously. "But I heard Frank yelling something about 'enough is enough,' and Ethan screaming back, 'You don't get to decide.' Then there was a loud crash like glass breaking or wood splintering." Betty had thought little of it at the time. After all, arguments between father and son weren't uncommon knowledge in Maplewood. But now those raised voices took on a sinister tone. Then came the forensic findings. Investigators lifted fingerprints from the rusted lock securing the iron cage, and they matched Ethan's. Worse still, traces of fresh oil were found on the mechanism, suggesting someone had deliberately maintained it recently. In the garage, tools used to reinforce the cage showed signs of recent use, their edges still sharp with metal shavings. Sheriff Grayson confronted Ethan again, this time with hard facts. "You want to tell me why your prints are on that lock?" he asked, his voice low and steady. Ethan slumped forward, his face buried in his hands. For a moment, he didn't respond. When he finally spoke, his words tumbled out in a disjointed rush. "I didn't mean for him to. I just wanted him to understand." Ethan choked on his own breath, tears streaming down his face. "He wouldn't listen. He never listened." "Understand what, Ethan?" Grayson pressed, leaning closer. "What exactly were you trying to make him see?" But Ethan only shook his head, unable or unwilling to elaborate. The townsfolk, once hesitant to believe such an accusation, began turning against Ethan en masse. Whispers turned into outright condemnation. Some recalled seeing Ethan stumbling drunk through town, muttering angrily under his breath. Others remembered Frank expressing concern about his son's behavior during casual conversations months prior. "He always said Ethan had a temper," remarked Carl Hargrove, the local hardware store owner. "But none of us ever imagined—" His voice trailed off, heavy with regret. Even Evelyn Harper, who had initially expressed sympathy for Ethan's struggles, found herself questioning whether she'd misjudged him. "He seems so lost," she admitted to a friend over coffee. But maybe that's what happens when you lose yourself completely. You hurt the people you love most. Yet amidst the growing outrage, doubts lingered in quieter corners of Maplewood. Why would Ethan go to such lengths to imprison his father, only to leave behind clues implicating himself? And if he truly intended harm, Why hadn't he disposed of the evidence more carefully? Frank's death was undeniably tragic, but the circumstances surrounding it hinted at layers of complexity far beyond a simple case of filial betrayal. For now, though, Ethan remained the prime suspect, and the weight of guilt hung heavily around his neck. Ethan sat slumped in the cold, sterile interrogation room at the Maplewood Sheriff's Department, his hands cuffed to the table in front of him. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across his gaunt face. His eyes were bloodshot, not just from lack of sleep, but from a storm of emotions that churned within him. Fear, anger, confusion, and something deeper, darker, that he couldn't quite name. Sheriff Grayson leaned forward, resting his elbows on the scarred wooden table. He had been in this line of work long enough to recognize guilt when he saw it, but there was something about Ethan's demeanor that didn't sit right with him. "Let's go over this again," Grayson said, his voice firm but not unkind. "You claim you didn't lock your father in that cage?" Ethan shook his head violently, as if trying to shake loose the accusations clinging to him. "I swear to God, I didn't do it," he exclaimed, his voice cracking under the strain. "Yes, we argued. Yes, I was angry. But I would never, never do something like that to my dad." Grayson raised an eyebrow. "Then explain the fingerprints on the lock, Ethan. Explain why tools in your garage show signs of recent use. Explain why no one else has come forward saying they saw anyone else around that night." "I don't know," Ethan shouted, slamming his fists against the table as far as the cuffs allowed. "Someone set me up. Someone wanted it to look like I did it." The room fell silent except for Ethan's ragged breathing. Grayson studied him carefully, searching for cracks in his story, or perhaps glimpses of truth buried beneath layers of denial. "Who, Ethan?" Grayson asked finally, leaning back in his chair. "If someone else is involved, who are they? And why would they frame you?" Ethan hesitated, his jaw tightening. For a moment it seemed like he might refuse to answer. Then in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, I think it has something to do with Dad's past." Grayson frowned. "What do you mean his past?" Ethan looked away, his gaze darting toward the wall as if trying to piece together fragments of memories too painful to confront directly. "Dad wasn't always the man everyone thought he was," he muttered. He made mistakes, big ones, things he never told anyone, not even me. But maybe someone found out. Maybe someone decided it was time for him to pay." Grayson leaned forward again, intrigued despite himself. "Mistakes? What kind of mistakes?" Ethan hesitated once more, then let out a bitter laugh devoid of humor. "That's the thing. I don't know. He kept secrets, Sheriff. Secrets I only caught glimpses of growing up. Letters he burned late at night, phone calls he took outside so no one could hear, places he went without telling anyone where he was going." He turned back to Grayson, desperation etched into every line of his face. "All I'm saying is, if you want answers, you need to dig deeper. Look into Dad's life before I was born, before Mom died. There's something there, something important, something dangerous." For a long moment, Grayson said nothing. The case had seemed straightforward at first glance. A troubled son lashes out at his father, driven by anger and alcohol. But now seeds of doubt began to sprout in his mind. If Ethan was telling the truth, even partially, the scope of the investigation widened dramatically. Still, evidence pointed overwhelmingly toward Ethan. Without concrete proof of another party's involvement, Grayson had little choice but to proceed accordingly. "We'll look into what you've said," Grayson promised, though his tone suggested skepticism. "But until then, you're staying here." As Ethan was led back to his cell, his shoulders sagged under the weight of his predicament. He knew how things looked from the outside, and he knew how easily people believed the worst about those already judged unworthy of trust. But deep down, he clung to one fragile hope, that somewhere, somehow, the real truth would surface. And maybe, just maybe, it would save him. Mary Thompson had always been a woman of quiet determination, her sharp mind and unyielding curiosity earning her accolades during her decades-long career as an investigative journalist in Chicago. But after losing her husband to cancer 2 years earlier, she'd traded the chaos of city life for the serene simplicity of Maplewood. She told herself it was time for peace, for reflection, a chance to heal wounds that still lingered beneath the surface. Yet when news of Frank Reynolds' death spread through town, Mary found herself unable to resist the pull of the story. It wasn't just morbid fascination. It was the nagging sense that something about the case didn't add up. The pieces fit together too neatly, like a puzzle assembled by someone who wanted them to appear complete but hadn't accounted for every detail. At first, Mary kept her involvement casual, attending community gatherings where whispers about the tragedy inevitably surfaced. She listened intently, jotting down notes disguised as grocery lists or gardening tips. Slowly, she began piecing together fragments of information. Rumors of Frank's secretive past, vague mentions of estrangement between father and son, and Betty Monroe's account of the argument the night before Frank disappeared. But what truly piqued Mary's interest was Ethan's insistence on his innocence and his cryptic claims about his father's hidden history. Most people dismissed his words as desperate attempts to deflect blame, but Mary saw something else, a glimmer of truth buried beneath layers of fear and confusion. One afternoon, Mary decided to pay a visit to Evelyn Harper. Known as the unofficial keeper of Maplewood's secrets, Evelyn welcomed Mary into her cozy kitchen with a steaming cup of tea and a plate of freshly baked cookies. "I know you've heard things," Mary said gently, taking a sip of her tea. "Things about Frank, and maybe even about Ethan." Evelyn hesitated, glancing toward the window as if expecting someone to overhear. "It's not my place to say," she murmured, stirring sugar into her own cup. "Maybe not," Mary replied, leaning forward. "But Frank deserves justice, doesn't he? And so does Ethan, if he's telling the truth." Evelyn sighed, setting her spoon down. "There were rumors," she admitted finally. "Years ago, before Ethan was born. People said Frank got mixed up with some bad folks. Gamblers, loan sharks, that sort of thing. He left town for a while, came back quieter than ever. Never spoke about where he'd been or what he'd done." Mary's brow furrowed. "Do you think those bad folks could have resurfaced?" "I suppose anything's possible," Evelyn said with a shrug. "But why now? After all these years?" That question lingered in Mary's mind as she left Evelyn's house. Why now indeed? Determined to uncover more, Mary turned her attention to Frank's workshop, a treasure trove of memories and clues waiting to be unearthed. With permission from the sheriff's department, she spent hours sifting through dusty shelves lined with tools, blueprints, and half-finished projects. Among the clutter, she discovered a small wooden box tucked away in a corner. Inside were faded photographs, brittle letters tied with string, and a worn leather journal. As Mary flipped through the pages of the journal, her pulse quickened. Entries dated decades earlier hinted at financial troubles, hushed meetings with unfamiliar names, and mounting debts. One passage stood out. "They're watching me. I can feel it. If they find out what I've done, there'll be hell to pay. I should never have agreed to help them. But how else was I supposed to save us?" The cryptic words sent chills down Mary's spine. Who were they? What had Frank agreed to do? And most importantly, had those old sins come back to haunt him and perhaps cost him his life? Meanwhile, Mary reached out to Carl Hargrove, the hardware store owner, hoping to learn more about Frank's recent activities. "He stopped by last month," Carl recalled, scratching his chin thoughtfully. "Bought some chains and locks, said he needed them for securing his tools. Seemed nervous, though. Kept looking over his shoulder like he expected someone to jump him." Mary nodded, making a mental note. Then almost casually she asked, "Did he mention anyone unusual hanging around? Someone new in town?" Carl frowned, thinking hard. "Now that you mention it, yeah, there was a guy. Showed up a few times asking about Frank. Said he was an old friend, but something about him didn't sit right. Tall fella, wore a black hat pulled low over his face. Never caught his name." A stranger in a black hat, another thread to follow. Back home, Mary pored over her findings late into the night, connecting dots and chasing leads. She knew she was getting closer to unraveling the mystery, but she also sensed danger lurking just beyond the edges of her investigation. Someone didn't want these secrets exposed, and they might not hesitate to silence anyone who got too close. Still, Mary couldn't stop now. Not when the truth felt so tantalizingly within reach. And deep down, she suspected that solving this case would mean confronting not only the darkness haunting Maplewood, but also the shadows lingering in her own heart. Mary Thompson's investigation into Frank Reynolds' past began to take shape as she pieced together fragments of information from the townsfolk, each revelation unraveling another layer of the enigma that was Frank. What emerged was a portrait far more complex and troubling than anyone in Maplewood had ever imagined. Her first breakthrough came during a conversation with Betty Monroe, who mentioned offhandedly that Frank had a knack for finding old treasures. Treasures? Mary asked, intrigued. Oh, sure, Betty replied, leaning back in her chair at the diner. He'd go on these weekend trips sometimes, come back with all sorts of oddities, old clocks, jewelry, even paintings, claimed he found them at estate sales or auctions, but I always thought there was more to it. Betty paused, lowering her voice conspiratorially. Some folks said he wasn't above selling rare artifacts to collectors willing to pay top dollar. Nothing illegal, mind you, unless those items weren't exactly his to sell. This new detail about Frank's life piqued Mary's interest. If Frank had been dealing in valuable and potentially questionable items, it opened up a world of possibilities. Who else knew about this side of him? And could it have led to trouble? Next, Mary spoke with Carl Hargrove, the hardware store owner, who provided yet another crucial clue. There was a man, Carl said, scratching his head thoughtfully. Came into town maybe 3 weeks before Frank. Well, before everything happened. Drove one of those flashy cars, the kind you don't see around here often. Black Mercedes, spotless. What did he look like? Mary pressed. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed sharp, like a city slicker, wore a black hat pulled low over his face, never introduced himself properly, just said he was an old friend of Frank's. Carl frowned, recalling the encounter. He came into my shop asking about Frank, wanted to know if I'd seen him recently. Something about the way he carried himself made me uneasy, like he was used to getting what he wanted, and didn't care how. No one else in town seemed to know much about the stranger, which only deepened the mystery. Where had he come from? What business did he have with Frank? And why had no one heard from him since Frank's death? But the most significant discovery came when Mary revisited Frank's workshop. Tucked away behind a loose floorboard beneath his workbench, she found a small, leather-bound journal filled with cryptic entries written in Frank's shaky handwriting. At first glance, the notes appeared disjointed, almost paranoid. They're watching, always watching. The debt must be paid, it's the only way. If they find out about the deal, we're both dead. As Mary flipped through the pages, certain phrases began to stand out. References to the buyer, the artifact, and the deadline. One entry, dated just days before Frank's disappearance, read, "He's coming tomorrow. I can't stall any longer. If I don't deliver, he'll make good on his threats. God help us all." Mary's heart raced as she absorbed the implications. It seemed Frank had gotten himself entangled in something dangerous, a transaction involving a rare artifact, a looming debt, and a menacing figure determined to collect. Back at her kitchen table, Mary spread out her findings. Photographs of Frank's antiques, Carl's description of the mysterious stranger, and photocopies of the journal entries. Slowly, a narrative began to form in her mind. Frank hadn't simply been a humble carpenter. He'd been dabbling in a shadowy world of high-stakes deals and illicit trades. Somewhere along the line, he'd made a grave mistake, perhaps acquiring an item he shouldn't have, or failing to meet the terms of a dangerous agreement. The mysterious stranger in the black Mercedes was likely the person Frank owed, or feared. And then there was Ethan's claim of innocence. Could it be possible that someone else had orchestrated Frank's imprisonment, using Ethan's troubled relationship with his father as a smokescreen? Or had Ethan unwittingly played into their hands, manipulated by forces beyond his understanding? As Mary delved deeper into the case, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Shadows seemed to linger too long outside her windows, and the hum of distant car engines echoed unnaturally late at night. She reminded herself that paranoia came naturally to investigators, but still she took precautions, locking her doors and keeping a flashlight within reach. Whatever secrets Frank Reynolds had taken to his grave, They were powerful enough to destroy lives, and Mary was beginning to wonder if she'd bitten off more than she could chew. Yet despite the risks, she pressed on, for Frank, for Ethan, and perhaps in some small way, for herself. Because in uncovering the truth about the Reynolds family, Mary might finally begin to heal the wounds of her own past. Mary decided it was time to speak directly with Ethan Reynolds. Despite his arrest and the weight of suspicion hanging over him, she sensed that he might hold the key to unlocking the mystery. Arranging a visit to the county jail, she sat across from him in a stark, dimly lit room, her notebook open, but her pen poised lightly, ready to listen more than write. Ethan looked worse than when she'd last seen him. His face was pale and drawn, dark circles underlining eyes clouded with exhaustion and despair. Yet there was a flicker of hope in his expression as Mary introduced herself, sensing that someone finally was willing to hear him out. "I didn't do this," Ethan began, his voice hoarse but steady. "But I know my dad wasn't himself in those last weeks. Something was eating at him, something big." Mary leaned forward slightly, encouraging him to continue. "He kept talking about being watched," Ethan said, his gaze fixed on the table between them, always looking over his shoulder, muttering to himself late at night. He even stopped going into town for supplies, saying it wasn't safe anymore. "What did he think was going to happen?" Mary asked gently. Ethan shook his head. "He wouldn't tell me everything, but he made it clear someone was after him, someone dangerous. He said they'd kill us both if we weren't careful." Mary's pulse quickened. This aligned with the cryptic entries in Frank's journal. But what had triggered such fear? "And then there was the argument," Ethan continued, his voice trembling now. "That night, Dad accused me of stealing something from him. A small wooden box, intricately carved. Said I'd betrayed him, that I didn't understand what I'd done." "Did you take it?" Mary asked, her tone neutral. "No," Ethan insisted, slamming his fist against the table. "I don't even know what he was talking about. But whatever it was, it meant something to him, something important enough to lose his mind over." Mary jotted down notes, her mind racing. The wooden box sounded significant, a tangible clue that could tie together the threads of Frank's paranoia, the mysterious stranger, and the ominous references in the journal. "Do you have any idea where the box might be now?" she asked. Ethan hesitated, then nodded slowly. "There's a hiding spot in the workshop, a false panel behind one of the shelves. Dad used to stash things there when I was a kid. If the box exists, that's probably where it is." After leaving the jail, Mary wasted no time returning to Frank's workshop. Her hands trembled slightly as she knelt beside the shelf Ethan had described, running her fingers along the edge until she felt a slight give. With a soft click, the false panel swung open, revealing a hollow space inside. And there it was, a small, intricately carved wooden box, its surface adorned with swirling patterns that seemed almost hypnotic. It was heavy for its size, suggesting it contained something substantial. Mary carefully opened the lid and froze. Inside lay a single object, a golden medallion etched with symbols she didn't recognize. Its craftsmanship was exquisite, ancient even, and it radiated an aura of significance far beyond its physical form. As Mary examined the medallion, she noticed a folded piece of paper tucked beneath it. Unfolding it, she found a handwritten note in Frank's shaky handwriting. "If you're reading this, it means I've failed. The medallion is cursed, or so they say. Whoever possesses it will suffer greatly unless the debt is paid. Trust no one, not even family." A chill ran down Mary's spine. The words echoed the paranoia and urgency she'd encountered in Frank's journal. Clearly, the medallion was central to the danger Frank had faced, and likely the reason for his death. Back at her kitchen table, Mary spread out her findings once again. The medallion, the note, the journal entries, and her notes from interviews with townsfolk. Slowly, a clearer picture began to emerge, but it raised as many questions as it answered. Frank had acquired the medallion somehow, possibly through his dealings in rare artifacts. Whoever sought it, the mysterious stranger in the black Mercedes, was desperate enough to resort to threats and violence. And Frank's fears about betrayal suggested he believed someone close to him had already been compromised. Could Ethan have been manipulated into handing over the medallion without realizing its importance? Or had the stranger coerced him into creating the illusion of guilt by locking Frank in the cage? One thing was certain. The medallion was far more than just a valuable artifact. It carried secrets, curses, and perhaps a history darker than anyone could imagine. As Mary studied the medallion, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being pulled deeper into a web of danger, one that extended far beyond Maplewood. Whoever wanted the medallion would stop at nothing to retrieve it, and now, thanks to her investigation, Mary herself might be standing directly in their path. Mary's hands trembled as she carefully lifted the small wooden box from its hiding place in Frank's workshop. The swirling carvings on its surface seemed to dance in the dim light, almost alive with mystery. She set it down on the workbench and opened it slowly, half expecting something otherworldly to leap out. Inside, nestled within faded velvet lining, were two items: a folded piece of yellowed parchment paper and what appeared to be an old map, brittle with age. Mary unfolded the map first, her breath catching as she took in the intricate details etched across it. Locations across Ohio were marked with red X's, each accompanied by cryptic notes scrawled in Frank's handwriting. Some markings referenced dates, others bore symbols that matched those carved into the box itself. But it was the parchment paper that truly captivated her attention. Carefully unfolding it, she revealed fragments of ancient symbols, some resembling runes, others geometric patterns that seemed to pulse with hidden meaning. Beneath the symbols, faint lines of text had been written in Latin, though much of it was smudged or illegible. One phrase stood out clearly: ad victoriam per umbram, to victory through shadow. Mary felt a chill run down her spine. These weren't just random artifacts. They were pieces of a puzzle tied to something far greater than she'd anticipated. Whatever Frank had stumbled upon, it wasn't merely valuable, it was dangerous. Back at home, Mary spread the contents of the box across her kitchen table, surrounding herself with books on mythology, archaeology, and cryptography. Her investigative instincts kicked into high gear as she attempted to decode the symbols and interpret the map. The locations marked on the map spanned rural towns, abandoned ruins, and even stretches of dense forest. Each site was annotated with brief descriptions: Iron Gate, Broken Seal; Stone Circle, Watch for Eyes; River Bend, Sacrifice Required. The annotations read like instructions or warnings. Mary couldn't help but wonder if these sites were connected to the medallion and the debt Frank had spoken of in his journal. Had he been collecting fragments of some larger artifact, or following a trail left behind by whoever originally possessed the medallion? Her research led her to a startling hypothesis. The symbols on the parchment might belong to an obscure cult once rumored to have operated in the region centuries ago. Known only as Umbra Victoris, Shadow of Victory, the group was said to worship an ancient entity associated with power, greed, and destruction. According to legend, they guarded a relic of immense significance, a relic that granted unimaginable wealth and influence to its possessor at a terrible cost. Could the medallion be part of this relic? And if so, why had Frank gotten involved with it? Determined to share her findings, Mary returned to the jail to speak with Ethan. When she showed him the map and parchment, his face went pale. "I've seen those symbols before," he whispered, his voice barely audible. They're from Mom's locket." "Your mother's locket?" Mary asked, leaning forward. Ethan nodded, his hands shaking. "She always wore it, even when she was sick. After she died, Dad kept it locked away in his desk. I never thought much about it until now." Mary's mind raced. If the symbols on the locket matched those on the parchment, it suggested a deeper family connection to whatever Frank had uncovered. Was this why Frank had feared betrayal? Not because Ethan had stolen from him, but because someone might exploit their shared history to manipulate them both? As Mary pieced together the clues, she began to suspect that Frank's imprisonment in the iron cage wasn't just personal revenge, it was a message. Someone wanted to send a clear signal: cooperate or suffer the consequences. And now, thanks to Mary's investigation, she might have inadvertently placed herself, and anyone else connected to the case, in grave danger. Late that night, as she sat poring over the map and parchment, Mary heard a sound outside her window, the faint crunch of gravel underfoot. She froze, her heart pounding. Whoever was watching her knew she was getting close. The journey to the abandoned church was fraught with tension and uncertainty. Mary and Ethan drove in silence, the weight of their mission pressing heavily on them both. The map had led them deep into the woods, down winding dirt roads that seemed to grow narrower and darker with each passing mile. The forest loomed ominously around them, its gnarled branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers. When they finally arrived, the church stood as a haunting silhouette against the moonlit night. Its steeple leaned precariously to one side, and the windows were shattered, leaving gaping holes that resembled hollow eyes. Vines snaked up the weathered stone walls, reclaiming the structure for nature's dominion. "This is it," Mary said softly, clutching the map in one hand and a flashlight in the other. "Whatever your father was protecting or running from, it's here." Ethan hesitated, his face pale but resolute. "If this clears my name, I need to see it through. For Dad." They stepped out of the car, the crunch of gravel beneath their feet unnervingly loud in the stillness. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, and an eerie quiet enveloped the area, broken only by the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. Pushing open the heavy wooden door, which groaned in protest, Mary and Ethan entered the church. Their flashlights cut through the darkness, revealing rows of pews covered in dust and cobwebs. At the far end of the nave stood an altar, its surface cracked and stained with age. Above it hung a faded tapestry depicting a shadowy figure surrounded by arcane symbols, symbols that matched those on the parchment and the medallion. Mary approached cautiously, her heart pounding as she examined the altar. Carved into its surface was a recessed indentation, shaped exactly like the medallion. "It fits," she murmured, pulling the golden artifact from her pocket. "Wait!" Ethan grabbed her arm, his voice urgent. "What if it's a trap? What if putting it there does something bad?" Mary hesitated, glancing back at him. "We don't have a choice. If we want answers, we have to take the risk." With trembling hands, she placed the medallion into the indentation. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a low rumble echoed through the church, shaking the ground beneath their feet. Dust rained down from the ceiling as a hidden compartment beneath the altar slid open, revealing a small, ornate chest. Inside the chest lay another piece of parchment, along with a single phrase written in bold letters. "The debt is blood." Before either of them could react, a voice rang out from the shadows. "Impressive work, Miss Thompson. You've done all the hard part for me." From the darkness emerged the mysterious stranger, the tall, broad-shouldered man in the black hat who had been asking about Frank weeks earlier. His sharp suit gleamed under the flickering light of Mary's flashlight, and his cold, calculating eyes fixed on the medallion. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his tone calm but menacing. "This isn't your fight." "Who are you?" Mary demanded, stepping protectively in front of Ethan. The man smirked. "Let's just say I represent certain interests. Interests your dear Mr. Reynolds thought he could cheat." Ethan stepped forward, his fists clenched. "You're the one who locked my dad in that cage, aren't you? You made it look like I did it." The stranger shrugged nonchalantly. "Your father owed us something valuable. When he refused to pay, we had to send a message. And you, my boy, were conveniently unstable enough to make a perfect scapegoat." Mary's mind raced. "What do you want with the medallion?" "It's not just a medallion," the man replied, his voice dripping with malice. "It's a key to power beyond your comprehension. And now, thanks to you, it's mine." As he reached for the medallion, Mary acted on instinct. Grabbing a nearby candlestick, she lunged at him, striking his arm and causing him to stumble. "Run!" she shouted to Ethan, grabbing the chest and the map. They bolted toward the exit, the stranger's furious shouts echoing behind them. Outside, the forest seemed alive with movement, shadows darting between the trees as if the very woods conspired against them. Mary and Ethan sprinted through the dense foliage, their breaths ragged and their hearts pounding. Behind them, the sound of pursuit grew louder, footsteps crashing through the underbrush, accompanied by the stranger's chilling voice. "You can't escape destiny," he called after them. "The debt will be paid, in blood." As they reached the car, Mary fumbled with the keys, her hands shaking. Just as she managed to unlock the doors, a figure appeared in the headlights, a hooded man wielding a wicked-looking blade. He lunged at them, but Ethan tackled him to the ground, buying Mary enough time to start the engine. "Get in!" she yelled, slamming the gas pedal as Ethan dove into the passenger seat. The tires spun wildly before finding traction, and they sped away, leaving the church and the stranger behind. Back in Maplewood, Mary and Ethan sat in stunned silence, the chest containing the second parchment resting between them. They had escaped for now, but the cryptic warning lingered in their minds. "The debt is blood," Mary whispered, staring at the words. "What does it mean?" Ethan shook his head, tears streaming down his face. "I don't know, but I think Dad knew. That's why he was so scared." One thing was certain. The mystery of Frank Reynolds' death was far from over. Whatever secrets the medallion held, they were tied to forces far darker and more dangerous than either of them could have imagined. And somewhere out there, the stranger waited, biding his time until the debt was paid. Inside Mary's modest living room, the pieces of the puzzle finally came together. Spread across her coffee table were the map, the parchment fragments, the medallion, and now an old photograph Mary had discovered tucked inside the false panel of Frank's workshop. The photo showed a much younger Frank standing beside a grand estate, his arm resting casually on a wooden crate marked with strange symbols, the same symbols etched into the medallion and the parchment. Mary studied the image closely, then turned to Ethan. "Do you recognize this place?" Ethan squinted at the photo, shaking his head. "No, but it looks familiar somehow, like something Dad might have talked about in passing." Mary nodded thoughtfully. "I think this is where it all began. This estate, it must belong to the Order of the Iron Key. That's who your father stole from." As they delved deeper into the clues, Mary pieced together the full story. Decades ago, Frank had been hired as a contractor to renovate parts of the mysterious estate owned by the Order, an ancient secret society rumored to dabble in occult practices and guard artifacts of immense power. During his work, Frank stumbled upon a hidden chamber containing a golden amulet said to hold mystical properties. Tempted by greed, or perhaps desperation, he took the amulet, believing its value could solve his mounting debts. But stealing from the Order came at a cost. According to legend, the amulet was no ordinary treasure. It was imbued with dark energy, capable of granting unimaginable power to its possessor, but also cursed to bring ruin upon those who dared to misuse it. When the Order discovered the theft, they vowed revenge, vowing to hunt down both the thief and the stolen artifact until the debt was repaid. Frank, terrified of what he'd unleashed, hid the amulet within the intricately carved wooden box, sealing it away in hopes of keeping it and himself safe. Yet the mere possession of the amulet drew danger to his doorstep. Over the years, the Order sent envoys to retrieve it, their threats growing more menacing with each failed attempt. Mary read aloud from one of Frank's journal entries, her voice trembling as she connected the dots. "They'll never stop coming. I thought hiding it would be enough, but nothing can protect us. Not me, not Ethan. The amulet brings only death and despair. If I don't return it soon, they'll make good on their promise. They'll take everything I love." Ethan listened in stunned silence, tears welling in his eyes. So that's why he was so paranoid, why he pushed everyone away. He wasn't just scared for himself. He was trying to protect me. Mary placed a comforting hand on Ethan's shoulder. "He didn't want you caught up in this nightmare. But now, because of his choices, we're all tangled in it." Suddenly, the stranger's actions made chilling sense. He wasn't merely an opportunist seeking profit. He was an agent of the Order, tasked with retrieving the amulet at any cost. By framing Ethan for Frank's imprisonment and murder, he aimed to send a clear message: cooperate or face annihilation. But why hadn't Frank simply returned the amulet? Why endure decades of fear and paranoia instead of ending the cycle? Mary found her answer in another journal entry, scrawled hastily in Frank's final days. "I tried to go back once, to give it to them and beg for mercy, but they wouldn't let me near the estate. They said the debt required more than the amulet. It required blood." Her stomach churned as she realized the horrifying truth. The Order wasn't content with reclaiming the stolen artifact. Their vengeance demanded retribution, a life for a life. The revelation left Mary and Ethan grappling with impossible questions. Should they try to return the amulet to the Order, risking their lives in the process? Or should they destroy it, hoping to break the curse and end the cycle of violence? Ethan clenched his fists, anger and grief warring within him. This is my fault. If I hadn't argued with Dad that night, if I hadn't accused him of lying about the box, they might never have gotten to him. No, Mary said firmly. This isn't your fault. Your father made mistakes, yes, but he did so out of fear and desperation. We can't change the past, but we can decide what happens next. She paused, staring at the medallion glinting ominously under the lamplight. If we're going to stop them, if we're going to honor your father's memory, we need to confront the Order head-on, but we'll need help. Together, Mary and Ethan devised a risky plan. Using the map and the remaining clues, they would locate the estate and infiltrate the Order's stronghold. Along the way, they hoped to gather allies, people who understood the stakes and were willing to stand against the shadowy organization. Yet even as they prepared for the journey ahead, Mary couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Shadows lingered too long outside her windows, and faint whispers seemed to echo through empty rooms. The Order knew they were coming, and they would be ready. Mary and Ethan sat at the kitchen table, the golden amulet resting between them like a dormant storm. Its surface shimmered faintly in the dim light, as though it pulsed with an otherworldly energy. They had been examining it closely, trying to decipher the strange symbols etched into its surface, when Mary suddenly froze. "Do you hear that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Ethan strained to listen, his breath catching as he heard it too. The faint creak of floorboards outside, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps circling the house. Shadows moved past the windows, dark silhouettes blocking out the moonlight. "They're here," Ethan said, panic rising in his chest. Before either of them could react, the front door burst open with a deafening crash. Masked figures clad in black robes poured into the room, their movements swift and deliberate. At their center stood the mysterious stranger, the man in the black hat who had haunted Maplewood for weeks. "Well, well," the stranger sneered, removing his hat to reveal sharp features and cold, calculating eyes. "Looks like we've found our prize." He gestured toward the amulet, his tone dripping with menace. "Hand it over, or things will get messy." Mary instinctively shielded the amulet with her body, her mind racing. "Who are you people? What do you want?" The stranger chuckled darkly, stepping forward. "Allow me to introduce myself properly. I'm Victor Kane, operative of the Order of the Iron Key. And this," he pointed at the amulet, "belongs to us." Ethan rose to his feet, his fists clenched. "You framed me for my father's murder. You made everyone believe I locked him in that cage." Victor shrugged nonchalantly, as if admitting to a minor inconvenience. "Your father stole from the Order. He knew the consequences. When he refused to return what was ours, we sent a message, one that would ensure compliance. Unfortunately, he didn't live long enough to cooperate." Mary's jaw tightened. "So you used Ethan as a pawn, made him look guilty so no one would question your involvement." Victor smirked, clearly enjoying their outrage. "Let's just say your little town wasn't exactly hard to manipulate. Now enough chit-chat. Give us the amulet, or we'll take it by force." Realizing they were outnumbered and outmatched, Mary quickly scanned the room for anything they could use as a weapon. Her gaze landed on a heavy cast-iron skillet hanging near the stove. Grabbing it, she hurled it at the nearest robed figure, striking him squarely in the head. He crumpled to the floor with a groan. "Go!" Mary shouted to Ethan, shoving the amulet into his hands. "Get out of here!" Ethan hesitated, torn between fleeing and staying to help, but Mary's fierce determination left him no choice. Clutching the amulet tightly, he bolted toward the back door, dodging two operatives who lunged at him. Victor cursed under his breath, signaling his men to pursue Ethan, while he turned his attention to Mary. "You're brave, Miss Thompson," he said, advancing slowly, "but bravery won't save you." Mary backed away, grabbing a chair and swinging it wildly to keep him at bay. If this thing is so valuable, why not just leave it alone? Why risk everything for revenge? Victor's expression hardened. "It's not about revenge. It's about balance. The amulet holds power that cannot fall into the wrong hands or remain unclaimed. Its theft disrupted centuries of order. We intend to restore it. But at what cost? Mary shot back. How many lives have been destroyed because of it? Frank's, Ethan's, yours? Her words seemed to strike a nerve. For a brief moment, Victor faltered, his mask of indifference slipping. Then with a growl, he lunged at her, tackling her to the ground. Meanwhile, Ethan sprinted through the woods behind Mary's house, the amulet clutched tightly in his hand. Branches whipped at his face, and his lungs burned with exertion, but he didn't dare stop. Behind him, the sound of pursuit grew louder. Robed figures crashing through the underbrush, shouting orders to each other. Just as he reached the edge of the forest, headlights appeared in the distance. A car skidded to a halt, and Sheriff Grayson stepped out, shotgun in hand. "Ethan!" the sheriff called, raising his weapon as the operatives emerged from the trees. "Get in the car!" Ethan dove into the passenger seat as Grayson fired a warning shot into the air, scattering the pursuers momentarily. Tires squealed as they sped away, leaving the masked figures and Victor Kane behind. Back at Mary's house, Victor finally subdued her, pinning her to the floor. "Where is it?" he demanded, his voice low and dangerous. Mary spat in his face, defiance blazing in her eyes. "You'll never find it." With a frustrated snarl, Victor released her and signaled his remaining men to retreat. As they disappeared into the night, Mary lay there, battered but resolute. Later, reunited at a safe location, Mary, Ethan, and Sheriff Grayson regrouped. Though shaken, they knew the battle was far from over. "The order won't stop," Mary said grimly. "They'll come after us again, and next time, they'll be ready." Ethan nodded, clutching the amulet protectively. "Then we need to end this, once and for all." Together, they began planning their next move, confronting the order directly and uncovering the truth behind the amulet's curse. But as they prepared to face the shadowy organization, one question lingered in their minds. Could the debt truly be paid, or would blood be the only price acceptable to the Order of the Iron Key? The confrontation took place in the same abandoned church where Mary and Ethan had first uncovered the shocking truth about Frank's past. The Order of the Iron Key had summoned them there, demanding the return of the amulet, or else. Surrounded by robed figures wielding ancient-looking weapons, Mary, Ethan, and Sheriff Grayson stood defiant, though outnumbered and outgunned. At the center of the room stood Victor Kane, flanked by two senior members of the Order. Their faces were obscured beneath ornate masks etched with runes that glowed faintly in the dim candlelight. The air was thick with tension, the weight of centuries of ritual pressing down on everyone present. Victor held out his hand, his voice cold and commanding. "The amulet. Now." Ethan hesitated, clutching the golden artifact tightly. His knuckles turned white as he glanced at Mary, silently seeking guidance. Mary stepped forward, her posture calm but resolute. She knew this moment would define not only their fate, but also the legacy of Frank Reynolds, and perhaps even the Order itself. "You've taken enough," Mary said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "Frank suffered for decades because of your obsession with retribution. He lived in fear, pushed away the people he loved, and ultimately died alone. All because you refused to let go of the past." Victor's expression didn't waver, but Mary noticed a flicker of doubt in his eyes. She pressed on, her words cutting deeper with each sentence. "Do you think vengeance brings honor? Do you believe more bloodshed will restore whatever balance you claim to protect? If so, then you're no better than the thieves and liars you despise." One of the masked elders stepped forward, their voice low and gravelly. "Silence, outsider. You do not understand the gravity of what you meddle with. The amulet is cursed, a vessel of chaos. Its power cannot remain uncontrolled. And yet," Mary countered, "you've allowed it to destroy countless lives in your pursuit of control. Frank's life, Ethan's freedom, my peace of mind. How many more must suffer before you realize that violence begets violence?" Mary turned her attention to the elder, her tone softening but still firm. "If the Order truly values justice, as you claim, then prove it. Let this end here. No more deaths, no more suffering. Take back your amulet, seal it away, and leave us alone. Allow Ethan to grieve his father without carrying the burden of your vendetta." For a long moment, silence filled the church. The flickering candles cast eerie shadows across the walls, making the scene feel suspended in time. Finally, the elder lowered their mask slightly, revealing weathered features etched with age and regret. "The boy speaks the truth," the elder murmured, addressing Victor. "We have chased this debt for too long, blinded by our own righteousness. Perhaps, perhaps it is time to break the cycle." Victor clenched his fists, clearly unwilling to concede. "You can't seriously consider letting them walk away. They stole from us. They betrayed us." "No," the elder replied sharply. "It was we who betrayed our purpose. Our duty is to guard, not to punish. To protect, not to destroy. This obsession with revenge has corrupted us." With visible reluctance, Victor gestured for his men to stand down. The robed figures lowered their weapons, retreating into the shadows of the church. One by one, the candles extinguished themselves, plunging the room into near darkness. The elder approached Mary and Ethan, extending a gnarled hand toward the amulet. "Give it to me," they said softly. "Let us undo what should never have been done." Ethan hesitated, then placed the amulet gently into the elder's palm. As soon as the artifact left his hands, he felt an overwhelming sense of relief, as if a great weight had been lifted from his shoulders. The elder cradled the amulet reverently, whispering words in a language none of them understood. A faint glow emanated from the artifact before fading completely. "It is done," the elder declared. "The amulet will be sealed within our vaults, never to trouble the world again." Turning to Mary and Ethan, they added, "Go now. Live your lives, and remember, forgiveness is the greatest act of strength." As Mary, Ethan, and Sheriff Grayson walked away from the church, dawn broke over the horizon, bathing the forest in warm golden light. It was as if the darkness that had consumed them for so long was finally beginning to lift. Ethan stopped abruptly, turning to Mary. "Thank you," he said, his voice choked with emotion, "for everything. I don't know what I would have done without you." Mary smiled faintly, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "Your father made mistakes, Ethan, but he loved you. Don't let his choices define you. Find a way to move forward." Sheriff Grayson cleared his throat, breaking the somber mood. "Well, folks, I reckon we've had enough excitement to last a lifetime. Let's head home and put this nightmare behind us." Weeks later, Ethan returned to Maplewood, determined to rebuild his life. He reopened Frank's workshop, using his father's tools to craft furniture that told stories of resilience and hope. Though the scars of the past remained, he found solace in creating something beautiful from the wreckage. Mary, too, began to heal. Investigating Frank's death had reignited her passion for storytelling, and she started writing articles highlighting the hidden struggles of small-town America. Through her work, she honored Frank's memory and reminded herself that even in the darkest moments, there is always a chance for redemption. As for the Order of the Iron Key, their existence faded back into myth, leaving behind only whispers carried on the wind. Whether they truly changed or simply retreated into the shadows, no one could say. But for Mary and Ethan, it didn't matter. They had faced the darkness and emerged stronger for it. As the first rays of dawn filtered through the broken stained glass windows of the abandoned church, the atmosphere shifted from tension to an uneasy calm. The elder of the Order of the Iron Key stood before Mary and Ethan, their mask now fully removed, revealing a face lined with years of burden and regret. In their hands, they cradled the golden amulet, its once menacing glow now dulled as if it had been subdued by the elder's ancient incantations. "You have made your case," the elder said, their voice steady but tinged with weariness, "and we will honor our vow to seal this artifact away where it can do no further harm." Victor Kane hovered nearby, his jaw clenched in barely contained fury. He opened his mouth to protest, but a sharp glance from the elder silenced him. Whatever authority the elder held over the order was absolute, and even Victor dared not challenge it further. The elder turned back to Mary and Ethan, their gaze piercing yet softened by something akin to gratitude. "But know this," they warned, their tone firm. "What transpired here tonight must never be spoken of again. Speak of the order, and you risk invoking forces beyond your comprehension. We are bound by oaths older than time itself, and we do not forgive betrayal lightly." Mary met their gaze without flinching. "You have my word," she said evenly. We only want to move on with our lives. Leave Maplewood and don't come back." Ethan nodded silently, still clutching the memories of his father's suffering, too close to feel anything but relief at the prospect of closure. The elder studied them for a moment longer, then gestured to the other members of the order. Without another word, the robed figures began to file out of the church, disappearing into the mist-shrouded woods like ghosts returning to the ether. Victor lingered behind briefly, his cold eyes locking onto Mary's with a promise of unspoken retribution should their paths ever cross again. Then with a final sneer, he followed the others into the night. Moments later, the church was empty save for Mary, Ethan, and Sheriff Grayson. The air seemed lighter, as though the oppressive weight of the order's presence had lifted along with their departure. Yet the eerie silence that remained served as a stark reminder of the power they had faced and narrowly escaped. Mary exhaled deeply, leaning against one of the pews for support. Her legs felt weak, her mind racing with the enormity of what had just transpired. She glanced at Ethan, whose expression mirrored her own mix of exhaustion and disbelief. "They're gone," she whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. "For now," Grayson muttered grimly, adjusting his hat as he scanned the shadowy corners of the church. "Let's hope they keep their end of the bargain." Ethan stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the altar where the amulet had rested moments ago. Do you think Dad would have wanted this? For us to let them take it?" Mary placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Your dad spent his life running from that thing. It controlled him, terrified him, and ultimately cost him everything. By letting them take it, we're breaking the chain. That's what he would have wanted." Ethan nodded slowly, tears welling in his eyes. "I just wish I could have told him I didn't hate him, that I understood." Mary squeezed his shoulder reassuringly. "He knew, Ethan. Deep down, he always knew." As they left the church, the rising sun bathed the forest in warm hues of gold and amber, chasing away the lingering shadows of the night. The three walked in silence, each lost in their thoughts but united by the shared ordeal they had survived. Back in Maplewood, life slowly returned to normal, or as close to normal as it could be after such an extraordinary event. Rumors about Frank's death eventually faded, replaced by whispers of new beginnings. Ethan threw himself into restoring his father's workshop, channeling his grief into crafting pieces that reflected hope and resilience. Neighbors began to see him differently, not as the troubled man who locked his father in a cage, but as someone trying to rebuild his shattered world. Mary found solace in writing, pouring her experiences into articles that shed light on the hidden struggles of small towns like Maplewood. Though she never mentioned the order or the amulet explicitly, her words carried a depth earned through harrowing truths. Sheriff Grayson kept the incident under wraps, filing it away as an unsolved mystery, rather than risking exposure of the forces they had encountered. But late at night, when the stars hung low over Maplewood, he couldn't help but wonder if the order truly stayed gone, or if they were watching, waiting for the next chapter to unfold. Months later, Mary visited Ethan in his newly restored workshop. The scent of freshly cut wood filled the air, mingling with the faint aroma of coffee brewed strong enough to wake the dead. On the wall hung a framed photograph of Frank, smiling warmly beside a younger Ethan during happier times. "You've done amazing work here," Mary said, admiring a beautifully crafted table that stood proudly in the center of the room. "Thanks," Ethan replied, handing her a mug of coffee. "It helps. Keeps me grounded." They sat together in companionable silence, the weight of their shared past easing with each passing day. But as Mary sipped her coffee, she noticed something etched faintly into the edge of the table, a single symbol resembling those carved into the amulet. Her breath caught, and she looked up at Ethan. "Did you mean to put that there?" Ethan followed her gaze, then shrugged with a faint smile. "Maybe. Or maybe it's just a reminder, a way to make sure we never forget how far we've come." Mary nodded, tracing the symbol with her fingertip. It was a reminder indeed, not just of the darkness they had faced, but of the light they had found within themselves. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, carrying with it the faintest whisper of voices long since silenced. Whether it was a blessing or a warning, neither Mary nor Ethan could say. But for now, they chose to believe it was peace. Weeks after the harrowing confrontation with the Order of the Iron Key, Life in Maplewood began to settle into a fragile semblance of normalcy. The sheriff's department officially closed Frank Reynolds' case due to insufficient evidence tying Ethan directly to his father's death. Without concrete proof that Ethan had locked Frank in the iron cage, or worse, the charges against him were dropped. But while the law may have declared him innocent, Ethan knew better than anyone that legal exoneration did nothing to ease the weight pressing on his heart. He returned to the quiet solitude of the Reynolds farm, now haunted by memories both tender and bitter. Every corner of the house seemed to echo with fragments of conversations left unfinished, apologies unspoken, and years wasted in silence. The guilt gnawed at him relentlessly, not for the crime he hadn't committed, but for the relationship he'd allowed to fracture beyond repair. Ethan spent long hours in Frank's workshop, surrounded by tools and wood shavings that smelled faintly of cedar and regret. He worked tirelessly, crafting furniture as if each piece could somehow bridge the chasm between himself and his father. Yet no matter how many tables he built or chairs he carved, the ache in his chest remained. One evening, Mary visited the workshop, finding Ethan slumped over a half-finished cabinet, his hands streaked with sawdust and his eyes hollow with exhaustion. "How are you holding up?" she asked gently, pulling up a stool beside him. Ethan gave a humorless laugh, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "Depends on what you mean. Legally, I'm free. Emotionally, not so much." Mary nodded, her expression sympathetic. "You're carrying a lot, Ethan, but some of it isn't yours to carry." "That's the thing," Ethan said, his voice breaking slightly. "It is mine. Dad and we never really talked, not about the important stuff. All those years I blamed him for Mom's death, for leaving us behind when he remarried, for everything. And then, when he needed me most, I wasn't there. I was too busy drowning my own problems to see how scared he was." Mary placed a comforting hand on his arm. "You can't change the past, Ethan. None of us can. But you can honor your dad's memory by forgiving yourself, and him. Holding on to anger and guilt only keeps you trapped." Ethan looked away, blinking back tears. "Easier said than done." "I know," Mary replied softly. "But you don't have to do it alone. That's why I'm here." Over time, Ethan began to take small steps toward healing. He started attending community gatherings again, cautiously reconnecting with neighbors who had once judged him harshly. To his surprise, many greeted him with kindness, offering support rather than suspicion. At first, Ethan found it difficult to accept their gestures. He still felt like an outsider looking in, burdened by the secrets he couldn't share. But as weeks turned into months, he realized that redemption wasn't about erasing the past. It was about building something new from its ashes. One day, while working on a custom order for Evelyn Harper, a rocking chair adorned with intricate carvings, he found himself smiling for the first time in what felt like forever. It wasn't just pride in his craftsmanship, it was the realization that he was creating something beautiful out of pain, something Frank would have been proud of. On the anniversary of Frank's death, Ethan organized a small memorial service at the edge of the property, near the towering oak tree where he and his father used to sit during summer evenings. Neighbors gathered quietly, sharing stories about Frank's kindness, his skill as a carpenter, and the quiet dignity with which he carried himself. When it was Ethan's turn to speak, he stood beneath the sprawling branches, his voice trembling but resolute. "My dad wasn't perfect," he admitted, gripping the podium tightly. "Neither was I. We made mistakes, big ones, and maybe we'll never know if things could have been different between us. But one thing I do know is this. He loved me, and even though I didn't always show it, I loved him too." Ethan paused, glancing at the crowd before continuing. "So today, instead of focusing on what we lost, I want to celebrate what we had. My dad taught me how to build things, not just with wood, but with patience, care, and love. And moving forward, that's exactly what I plan to do." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden light across the gathering, Ethan unveiled a plaque mounted on the trunk of the oak tree. Engraved on it were the words, "Frank Reynolds, 1948 to 2023, a man of strength, skill, and heart. May his legacy live on in all he touched." Tears streamed down Ethan's face as applause broke out among the attendees. For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of peace, a sense that, despite everything, he and his father were finally reconciled. Life in Maplewood continued, its rhythms steady and familiar. Mary resumed her writing, drawing inspiration from the resilience she'd witnessed in Ethan and the town itself. Sheriff Grayson kept watch over the community, occasionally glancing toward the woods late at night. But whether he was searching for lingering shadows or simply reflecting on the mysteries they had faced, no one could say. For Ethan, each day brought new challenges and opportunities to rebuild. Though the scars of the past would always remain, he chose to focus on the future. A future shaped not by fear or regret, but by hope and forgiveness. And somewhere, deep within the recesses of the forest, the whispers of the Order of the Iron Key faded into silence, their secrets buried once more beneath the earth. In the weeks following the events at the abandoned church, Mary Thompson found herself unable to shake the lingering weight of what she had uncovered. The Order of the Iron Key may have vanished into the night, their secrets buried once more beneath layers of shadow and silence. But Mary knew their kind wasn't unique. Across history, similar secret societies had operated in the dark, wielding power through fear, greed, and manipulation. Though bound by her promise never to speak of the order, Mary resolved that their actions would not go entirely unchallenged. If she couldn't name them directly, she could still shine a light on the dangers posed by such organizations, and perhaps prevent others from suffering as Frank Reynolds had. Sitting at her kitchen table late one evening, Mary typed the final lines of an article destined for a national investigative journal. Titled Shadows of Power, The Hidden World of Secret Societies, the piece delved into historical accounts of clandestine groups whose obsessions with control and retribution had left trails of destruction in their wake. Drawing on decades of research, Mary wove together stories of stolen artifacts, cursed relics, and families torn apart by vendettas spanning generations. She highlighted patterns of corruption, exploitation, and violence, all without naming specific individuals or groups. Her words were measured, her tone analytical yet impassioned. For centuries, humanity has been captivated by tales of hidden orders guarding ancient secrets. But behind the mystique lies a darker truth. These organizations often prioritize power over people, vengeance over justice. Their insatiable hunger for control blinds them to the suffering they inflict upon innocent lives. It is time we question whether such entities deserve our awe or our scrutiny. Mary submitted the article under a pseudonym, ensuring her identity remained concealed. She knew the risks of challenging forces that preferred to operate unseen, but she also understood the importance of standing up to tyranny, even if only through the written word. When the article was published months later, it sparked widespread discussion. Readers debated its implications, some dismissing it as conspiracy theory, while others praised its boldness. Historians and journalists began revisiting old cases involving missing artifacts and mysterious disappearances, drawing connections Mary had subtly hinted at in her writing. Closer to home, the article reached the residents of Maplewood, who read it with a mix of curiosity and unease. While no one explicitly linked the piece to Frank Reynolds' death, many sensed that Mary's work carried deeper meaning. Evelyn Harper, ever perceptive, pulled Mary aside after Sunday service one morning. "You didn't write this just for kicks, did you?" she asked, arching an eyebrow knowingly. Mary smiled faintly, choosing her words carefully. "Let's just say I've seen enough to know there are truths worth telling, even if they come with risks." Evelyn nodded, patting her hand approvingly. "Well, whatever your reasons, I'm proud of you. Someone needed to say it." Though Mary never received direct confirmation of her article's impact, subtle changes began to emerge. Other writers picked up where she left off, exposing corruption tied to powerful institutions. Communities grew more vigilant, questioning authority and demanding transparency. For Mary, the act of writing became both catharsis and purpose. By confronting the shadows of the past, she reclaimed a sense of agency and reminded herself that even in the face of overwhelming darkness, courage could spark change. One crisp autumn afternoon, as she walked through Maplewood's town square, Mary paused to admire the golden leaves drifting lazily to the ground. The air smelled of cider and wood smoke, carrying with it the comforting familiarity of home. She thought of Frank, Ethan, and the choices that had shaped their lives, and hers. Though the scars of their ordeal would always remain, They served as reminders of resilience, redemption, and the enduring power of forgiveness. And somewhere, deep within the recesses of the forest, the whispers of the Order of the Iron Key faded further still. Their grip on the world loosened, if only slightly, by the light Mary had dared to cast upon the shadows. Months had passed since the harrowing events that unraveled the truth behind Frank Reynolds' death, and Maplewood had returned to its quiet rhythm. Life moved forward as it always did, but for Mary Thompson, the echoes of the past lingered like whispers on the breeze. On a crisp autumn evening, she sat on her porch with a steaming mug of tea cradled in her hands. The sun hung low in the sky, painting the horizon in hues of amber and rose. Shadows stretched long across the fields, their edges softened by the golden light. It was a moment of stillness, a rare reprieve from the storm of questions that had consumed her for so long. As she watched the sun set, Mary's thoughts drifted back to the case that had changed everything. The iron cage, the medallion, the Order of the Iron Key. She thought of Frank, his kindness, his secrets, and the weight of the choices he'd made. She thought of Ethan, burdened by guilt, yet determined to rebuild. And she thought of herself, the outsider who had stumbled into a mystery far greater than she could have imagined. Mary sighed softly, setting her mug down on the wooden railing. For all her years as an investigative journalist, she had always believed that every question had an answer, every mystery a solution. But now, sitting amidst the serene beauty of the countryside, she realized something profound. Some mysteries were never meant to be fully understood. The Order of the Iron Key had vanished into the shadows, their secrets buried once more. Though Mary had exposed the dangers of similar societies through her article, she knew there were forces in the world beyond comprehension, and perhaps beyond reckoning. Some truths carried a cost too high to pay. She glanced at the stack of papers resting on the table beside her, the notes, photographs, and fragments of research she had collected during her investigation. Tomorrow she would pack them away in a box and store them in the attic, sealing off that chapter of her life for good. But as much as Mary had come to accept the limits of knowledge, she also recognized the complexity of human nature. Frank Reynolds hadn't been a villain. He had been a man driven by desperation, making choices born of fear and circumstance. His theft of the amulet wasn't justified, but it was understandable. A flawed act committed by someone trying to protect what little he had left. And Ethan, Mary smiled faintly, thinking of how far he had come. He wasn't the same man who had stormed out of his father's house that fateful night. Through pain and perseverance, he had found a way to honor Frank's memory. Not by erasing the past, but by building something meaningful from its ruins. Even Mary herself had changed. Investigating the case had forced her to confront her own fears and vulnerabilities, reminding her that healing came not from answers, but from connection. As the last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon, Mary leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes against the cool evening air. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, and the faint hum of crickets filled the silence. She thought about the words she had written in her article, that power unchecked often led to destruction, but humanity's capacity for courage and compassion could shine even in the darkest corners. Those words weren't just for others, they were for her too. Opening her eyes, Mary gazed at the stars beginning to twinkle in the deepening twilight. She didn't know what the future held, for herself, for Ethan, or for Maplewood, but she felt a quiet sense of peace. Some mysteries might remain unsolved, and some wounds might never fully heal. But even in the face of uncertainty, there was hope. Hope that redemption was possible. Hope that forgiveness could mend broken bonds. And hope that no matter how dark the night, the dawn would always return. With one final glance at the horizon, Mary rose from her chair, gathering her mug and notes. As she stepped inside, she whispered softly to herself, almost like a prayer. "Good night, Frank. Wherever you are, I hope you found your peace." And with that, she closed the door behind her, leaving the day and the mystery behind. Several weeks after the conclusion of the harrowing events, Mary was surprised to hear a knock at her door one crisp autumn afternoon. Opening it, she found Ethan standing on her porch, his hands shoved nervously into the pockets of his jacket. He looked different, healthier, more at peace, though traces of sorrow still lingered in his eyes. "Ethan," Mary said warmly, stepping aside to let him in. What brings you here? I just, I wanted to say thank you, Ethan replied, his voice thick with emotion, for everything you did for me, for my dad. If it weren't for you, I don't know where I'd be right now. Mary smiled gently, gesturing for him to sit down. You don't have to thank me, Ethan. We got through it together. But Ethan shook his head firmly. No, I do. You didn't have to get involved, but you did. And because of that, I've been given a second chance, a chance to make things right. As they sat across from each other at Mary's kitchen table, Ethan opened up about the plans he had been working on since his release. I've been thinking a lot about Dad lately, he began, his gaze distant as if recalling memories both painful and cherished. About who he was, and who I want to be moving forward. He wasn't perfect, but he gave so much to this town without ever asking for anything in return. His woodworking touched people's lives in ways I never fully appreciated until now. Ethan paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. I've decided to donate most of his tools to the local schools. There are kids out there who could learn so much from them. Kids who might not otherwise have access to something like that. It feels right, you know? Like it's a way to keep his spirit alive while helping others. Mary's eyes softened, pride swelling in her chest. That's a beautiful idea, Ethan. Your dad would have loved that. Ethan nodded, a faint smile breaking through the sadness. Yeah, I think he would have too. And maybe it'll help repair some of the damage I caused, not just to him, but to everyone else whose trust I broke. Ethan went on to share that he had also started reaching out to members of his extended family, cousins, aunts, and uncles he hadn't spoken to in years. Though their relationships were strained, many had welcomed him back with cautious optimism, eager to reconnect after hearing about his efforts to rebuild. It's slow going, Ethan admitted, rubbing the back of his neck sheepishly, but every conversation feels like a step in the right direction. I want to honor Dad by fixing what I can, not just for me, but for all of us. Mary reached across the table, placing a comforting hand over his. You're doing exactly what your father would have wanted, Ethan. Redemption isn't about erasing the past. It's about building a better future, and from what I've seen, you're off to a great start. Ethan's eyes glistened with unshed tears, but his smile grew stronger. Thanks, Mary. Really. I couldn't have done any of this without you. Before leaving, Ethan handed Mary a small wooden box carved with intricate designs, the same design Frank had once etched into the lid of the hidden compartment. Inside was a delicate wooden bird, its wings spread as if caught mid-flight. This was one of Dad's pieces, Ethan explained, his voice soft. I thought you should have it, as a reminder of everything we went through, and everything we gained because of it. Mary accepted the gift with trembling hands, overwhelmed by its significance. It's beautiful, Ethan. Thank you. As Ethan stepped off the porch and walked toward his truck, Mary watched him go, feeling a renewed sense of hope. The road ahead wouldn't be easy for him, or for anyone touched by the tragedy, but she knew he was ready to face it head-on. Standing there beneath the golden light of the setting sun, Mary realized something profound. Even in the aftermath of darkness, new beginnings could take root. Families could heal, communities could grow stronger, and forgiveness, though difficult, was always worth pursuing. With a quiet smile, Mary closed the door and placed the wooden bird on her mantle, where it would serve as a lasting tribute to the resilience of the human spirit. As Ethan's truck disappeared down the winding country road, Mary lingered on her porch, the wooden bird cradled gently in her hands. The late afternoon sun bathed the landscape in warm, golden light, casting long shadows that stretched toward the horizon. She watched until the dust settled and the sound of the engine faded into silence, leaving only the rustle of leaves and the distant chirping of birds. For a moment she stood there, reflecting on everything that had transpired, the mystery, the danger, the heartache, and ultimately, the redemption. It wasn't just Ethan who had been given a second chance. Mary realized she had found one too. Investigating Frank Reynolds' death had forced her to confront her own grief, her loneliness, and the lingering pain of losing her husband. In helping Ethan uncover the truth, she had rediscovered her purpose, not just as a journalist seeking answers, but as someone capable of making a difference in the lives of others. She thought about the article she'd written, the woodworking tools Ethan planned to donate, and the quiet steps he was taking to rebuild his family's fractured legacy. Each act was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, a reminder that even in the face of unimaginable loss, healing was possible. With a deep breath, Mary stepped back inside, placing the wooden bird carefully on her mantel. Its delicate wings seemed poised to take flight, a symbol of hope and renewal amidst the scars of the past. As she closed the door behind her, she felt an unexpected sense of peace settle over her, a quiet certainty that, despite the darkness they had faced, the light had prevailed. Mary returned to her kitchen, pouring herself a cup of tea as the house grew still around her. Outside, the world continued its steady rhythm, the wind whispering through the trees, the sun sinking lower in the sky, painting the fields in hues of amber and rose. She smiled softly to herself, knowing that some endings weren't truly endings at all. They were beginnings. And this one felt like a promise.